They tell you that life under the Emperor's light is hard but purposeful, that sacrifice brings meaning, that duty redeems all suffering. They don't tell you about Krieg, where children are born in darkness 500 meters underground and never see sunlight in their entire lives, where every breath comes through filters because the air itself is poison, where existence is measured not in joy or fulfillment, but in how many bodies you can produce for the Imperial Guard before radiation sickness or despair finally claims you. If you want to understand what happens when an entire planet is transformed into a factory that produces only soldiers and death, subscribe to this channel as we explore the horrifying daily reality of civilian life on Krieg, the world that committed planetary genocide and somehow decided the punishment for that sin was eternal penance through suffering. Designation 4726, female wakes to sirens that have marked every morning of her 17 years of existence. The sound echoes through the rockcrete corridors of Hab, level 447 Gamma, a residential section carved into the planet's crust at a depth of 530 meters below the surface that was once Krieg's landscape. She opens her eyes. Designation does not use personal names. Such things are remnants of the selfish individualism that led to the heresy, the civil war that killed 5 billion people and made the surface uninhabitable, and sees the same gray ceiling she has seen every morning of her life. The same moisture condensation dripping from pipes that carry recycled water. The same fungal growth in the corners that maintenance servitors never quite eliminate. She sits up in her bunk, 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, stacked 3 high in a dormitory that houses 300 female adolescents aged 15 to 18. The bunks are separated by half-meter aisles just wide enough for a person to walk sideways. There are no personal possessions because possessions encourage attachment to material wealth rather than spiritual dedication to duty. 4726 female reaches for her rebreather, the mask that has been part of her face since birth. Every Krieg citizen wears one constantly, removing it only in the few pressurized spaces where the air is guaranteed pure. Even here, 500 meters down, the atmosphere carries trace radiation and chemical contaminants from the war that ended 500 years ago, but whose consequences will persist for thousands of years more. She secures the mask, feeling the familiar pressure of the seal against her face, hearing the slight hiss as the filtration system activates. The taste of recycled air fills her mouth, metallic, slightly sweet from the chemical scrubbers, nothing like the natural air she's read about in the educational materials, but has never and will never experience. Around her, 300 other girls perform identical routines. No talking. Conversation during morning routine is inefficient and discouraged. No dawdling. The schedule allows exactly 6 minutes from wake up siren to formation. No individuality. Everyone wears identical gray coveralls. Everyone has identical short, cropped hair. Everyone moves with identical trained precision. 4726. Female joins her assigned group in the corridor, forming ranks with automatic precision born of daily repetition since age 5. The girls stand at attention, eyes forward, waiting for morning inspection by the overseers. Civilians too old or too injured for guard service but still capable of maintaining discipline and productivity in the population centers. Overseer 89, male, walks the ranks slowly, examining each girl for signs of illness, weakness, or the subtle indicators of psychological instability that sometimes manifest in adolescence. Krieg cannot afford to waste resources on individuals who cannot fulfill their designated functions. Those who fail inspection are removed from the general population and reassigned to less critical duties if salvageable, or processed for biological recycling if not. The overseer stops in front of 4726, female, his respirator wheezing slightly with age or damage. His eyes, the only part of any Krieg citizen you can really see, examine her with clinical detachment, looking for deviation from norms, looking for weakness that might indicate genetic deficiencies that should not be allowed to propagate. Designation 4726, female, your complexion indicates possible anemia. Report to medical assessment after morning meal. Yes, Overseer. Her voice is flat, emotionless, exactly as trained. Showing fear of medical assessment would indicate weakness. Showing relief at passing inspection would indicate pride. Both are deviations from acceptable behavior. The inspection continues down the line. 3 girls are pulled from formation for immediate medical evaluation. One is shaking slightly, neurological symptoms that might indicate early radiation poisoning. The other 2 show skin lesions that could be fungal infections or early signs of more serious conditions. They leave the formation without protest, without backward glances, without any visible emotional response to being separated from their cohort. They might return tomorrow. They might not. Either outcome is equally acceptable to the Imperium's purposes, therefore it should be equally acceptable to them. Morning meal is consumed in silence in the communal feeding hall. The food is nutritionally adequate. Krieg's agricultural sectors deep underground produce sufficient calories and proteins to maintain the population at functional health levels. But it's also deliberately bland, designed to provide sustenance without pleasure, because pleasure in eating encourages gluttony and attachment to physical satisfaction. 4726, female receives her ration, a gray paste made from fungal proteins, a slice of dense bread from cave-grown grains, a cup of algae supplement rich in vitamins that the underground diet otherwise lacks. She eats mechanically, without tasting, her mind already focused on the day's assigned duties. Around her, thousands of civilians consume identical meals. Children as young as 5 sit in perfect silence, learning through repetition that meals are fuel stops, not social occasions. The elderly eat alone, their usefulness to the state diminishing with each passing year, their rations already reduced to the minimum necessary to sustain life until they can no longer contribute to production quotas. After the meal, 4726 female proceeds to her assigned labor station Manufacturum 7 Alpha 3 Sub, Level 6012, where components for Guard issue lasguns are assembled. She has worked here for 2 years, since her 15th birthday, when adolescents are transferred from education facilities to production facilities. The Manufacturum is a vast cavern carved from solid rock, its ceiling lost in darkness above industrial lighting that casts harsh shadows across endless assembly lines. Thousands of workers stand at their stations, performing repetitive tasks with machine-like precision. The only sounds are the hum of machinery, the hiss of rebreathers, and occasionally the screech of metal on metal when equipment malfunctions. 4076 female station involves installing focusing lenses into lasgun power packs. The task requires steady hands and attention to detail. Improperly installed lenses result in weapon malfunctions that could cost a soldier his life on a distant battlefield. She has installed an average of 437 lenses per shift for the past 2 years. Her error rate is 0.03%, which is slightly below the Manufacturum average of 0.05%, but not so far below as to draw attention as statistically anomalous. She works for 12 hours with 2 10-minute breaks and 1 30-minute meal period. The breaks are strictly timed. Workers who linger even 30 seconds beyond the allotted time are noted by the overseers and their rations reduced as punishment for inefficiency. During breaks, workers are permitted to remove their rebreathers briefly in designated pressurized rest areas. This is one of the few moments when faces are fully visible, when the masks that define Krieg identity are temporarily set aside. 4726, female sits in the break room and carefully removes her mask, feeling the cool recycled air against her face. Around her, other workers do the same. It should be intimate, this moment of shared vulnerability. This brief period when faces are exposed and human features visible. But no one makes eye contact. No one speaks beyond necessary functional communication. Everyone has learned that attachments lead to suffering when those you care about are inevitably killed in the Guard or die from the innumerable hazards of underground life. Better to maintain emotional distance, to see others as functional units rather than individuals, to accept that everyone, including yourself, is ultimately expendable in service to the Imperium. She drinks her water ration. Exactly 1 liter per 12-hour shift, calculated to maintain hydration without waste. The water tastes of minerals and chemical purification, nothing like the fresh water described in educational texts. But she's never known anything different, so there's no sense of loss, just acceptance of reality as it is. Her hands ache. 2 years of repetitive assembly work have created calluses and early signs of repetitive stress injury. In a few years, if the damage progresses, she'll be reassigned to less manual intensive work or, if the injury is severe enough to impact productivity significantly, removed from general population for resource reclamation. This thought occurs to her without emotion. It's simply the calculation of an organism optimizing its resource utilization. If she becomes too damaged to contribute adequately to the Imperium's military production, then her biological material should be recycled into forms that can still serve. Nutrients for the agricultural sections, raw biomass for the corps, starch rations that supplement the more expensive fungal proteins. The break ends. Masks are resealed. Work resumes. 437 more lenses installed with 0.03% error rate. 12 more hours of identical repetitive motion performed by a body that's slowly degrading from radiation exposure, chemical contamination, repetitive stress, and the simple grinding reality of life in an underground industrial complex where everything, including humans, is optimized for production efficiency rather than well-being or longevity. The shift ends. 4726, female and thousands of other workers file out of the manufactorum in orderly columns, moving through the corridors toward their assigned residential sectors. The corridors are functional. Bare rockcrete walls, harsh lighting, air circulation systems that hum constantly. There's no decoration because decoration serves no productive purpose. No art because art encourages emotional responses that distract from duty. But before returning to her HAB section, 4726, female has her medical assessment. She reports to Medical Station 447 Beta, a facility that handles routine health screening for her residential area. The facility is efficient. No waiting rooms with comfortable seating, no attempts to make the space less intimidating. Just processing bays where civilians are examined, diagnosed, and either cleared for continued work or processed for whatever intervention is necessary to restore functionality. A medici examines her with clinical precision. Blood sample extracted. Radiation dosage measured with a counter pressed against her skin. Visual examination of eyes, throat, skin for signs of common conditions. The whole process takes 8 minutes. Hemoglobin levels below optimal range. The medici announces in a voice devoid of concern or reassurance. Iron supplementation authorized for 30 days. If levels do not improve, genetic screening will be scheduled to determine cause of persistent anemia. 4726, female receives a small container of iron supplements, exactly 30 pills, 1 per day, to be consumed with morning meal. No discussion of what happens if the anemia is genetic, if it indicates some fundamental deficiency that might be passed to offspring. But she knows genetic deficiencies result in sterilization and permanent assignment to non-reproductive labor categories. She returns to her HAB section, takes her evening meal, identical in content and presentation to the morning meal, because dietary variation serves no functional purpose, and proceeds to the evening education period. All Krieg citizens receive continuous education throughout their lives, but the content is practical rather than intellectual. No philosophy, no art, no history beyond the basic narrative. Krieg was once prosperous, fell to heresy, was purged through civil war that killed billions and made the surface uninhabitable, now exists as permanent penance through service to the Imperial Guard. Tonight's lesson covers optimal techniques for recognizing contaminated water supplies. Tomorrow's will address proper protocols for responding to structural failures in underground facilities. Next week, they'll review the signs of psychological breaks that require reporting to the overseers for corrective intervention. There is no entertainment, no leisure, no time that isn't scheduled and optimized for either productive work or education that supports productive work. The concept of free time is viewed as evidence of the kind of selfish hedonism that led to the original heresy. After education, there is 1 hour of rest period before sleep cycle. 4726, female returns to her bunk, lies down and stares at the ceiling. This is the closest thing to personal time she experiences, 60 minutes before sleep, when she's not actively engaged in scheduled activities. She uses this time to think. About what? She's not entirely certain. Her thoughts circle around familiar patterns, assessment of the day's work performance, calculation of how many more years her hands will remain functional for assembly work, abstract awareness that her life is following the same pattern as every other female on Krieg in her demographic category. She doesn't think of this as suffering because she has no comparison point. This is simply life as it's always been, as it will continue until her biological utility is exhausted. The idea that life could be different, that people might work less, enjoy leisure, form emotional bonds, pursue individual interests, is so foreign as to be almost incomprehensible. Sometimes she has dreams. In the dreams, she's on the surface, seeing the sky, the educational materials mention, but she can't really conceptualize. In the dreams, the air doesn't need filtering and her face is bare, and she's walking across ground that's not rockcrete or metal grating, but something organic, something growing. She wakes from these dreams with a feeling she doesn't have words for. Not quite sadness, not quite longing, just a sense of something missing that she can't identify or name. The feeling usually passes within minutes of waking as the routine reasserts itself, as scheduled activities fill her consciousness and leave no space for abstract yearnings. Years pass this way. 4726, female transitions through the standard life stages of a Krieg female civilian. At 18, she's transferred to the reproduction facility and assessed for breeding suitability. The assessment is thorough and dehumanizing. Genetic screening for heritable defects, physical examination of reproductive capacity, psychological evaluation to ensure stable enough personality for pregnancy and basic child rearing before transfer to communal child facilities. She passes all assessments. Her genetics are clean, her physical health adequate. Her psychological profile falls within acceptable parameters for maternal designation. She's assigned to a male with compatible genetic profile and transferred to the breeding facility for a 3-month reproduction cycle. The male designated as her genetic partner is Designation 8934, male, age 21, assigned to manufacturing work in the ammunition production sector. They meet exactly twice, once for genetic material exchange verification, once for the actual reproductive act that will create the next generation of Krieg citizens. There is no courtship because courtship implies choice and individual preference. There is no romance because romance implies emotional attachment that might compromise duty. There is no even basic human connection because connection creates vulnerability to suffering when inevitable separation occurs. They perform their reproductive duty with mechanical efficiency. Neither experiences pleasure. Pleasure in reproduction is viewed as evidence of degeneracy, the kind of hedonism that led to the heresy. The act is functional, brief, witnessed by medical staff to ensure proper technique and completion. 4726, female returns to her HAB section afterward. She will not see 8934, male again if reproduction is successful. She will not raise the child herself. Children are raised communally to prevent the formation of familial attachments that might compromise loyalty to the Imperium over loyalty to kin. The pregnancy is confirmed 3 weeks later. 4726, female is transferred to maternal housing, a section of the HAB complex designated for pregnant females where work assignments are modified to prevent fetal harm while maintaining productivity. She continues assembly work, but at reduced hours, 8 hours per shift instead of 12, with additional rest breaks. Her rations increase to provide adequate nutrition for fetal development. She receives medical monitoring twice weekly to catch any complications that might threaten productivity. Pregnancy on Krieg is not celebrated. There are no baby showers, no excited preparation, no expression of joy at the upcoming birth. Children are production units, genetic material being processed into future soldiers or workers. The pregnancy is noted in population management databases, tracked for statistical purposes, but not treated as a personal milestone or achievement. 4726 female experiences the physical changes of pregnancy without emotional component. Her body swells, her biochemistry shifts, her internal organs rearrange to accommodate growing fetal tissue. She observes these changes with detached interest, the way one might observe a piece of machinery transitioning between operational states. She doesn't think of the fetus as her baby. It's a developing production unit that happens to be utilizing her body as its manufacturing facility. In 7 months, it will be extracted and transferred to the communal child rearing facilities where it will be designated, educated, and eventually assigned to either guard service or civilian support roles. Whether it will be male or female matters only for future reproduction planning. Whether it will be healthy or defective determines whether it completes development or is terminated and recycled. Whether it will survive to adulthood is statistically unlikely. Krieg child mortality rates are significantly higher than imperial averages due to radiation exposure, industrial accidents, and the general harshness of underground life. These are just facts, to be accepted without emotional response. The birth occurs in Medical Station 447, Beta, the same facility where she was diagnosed with anemia years ago. Labor is conducted with clinical efficiency. No partner present to offer support because partners don't exist in meaningful sense. No family to celebrate because family units don't exist. Just medical staff monitoring vital signs and ensuring the extraction process proceeds within acceptable parameters. The pain is substantial. Childbirth evolved to be difficult and dangerous, a biological reality that no amount of imperial technology has fully eliminated. 4726, female endures 23 hours of labor before the infant is finally extracted. She's allowed to see it briefly. Female designation, apparently healthy, approximately 3 kilograms, lung function adequate. Then it's taken away to the nursery facilities. 426, female will not see this child again unless they happen to be assigned to the same sector at some point in the future. And even then there would be no way to identify it as specifically her genetic offspring. She's given 3 days of recovery time before being returned to work assignments. Her body has been damaged by the pregnancy and birth. Pelvic structure altered, abdominal muscles stretched, various minor complications that will affect her physical capacity going forward. But she's still functional, still capable of contributing to productivity, so she resumes her position on the assembly line. Her ration allocation drops back to pre-pregnancy levels. Her medical monitoring returns to standard monthly screening. Her life resumes exactly as it was before, except now there's another human being in existence who carries half her genetic material and whom she will never know, never raise, never develop any relationship with whatsoever. This is considered normal. This is considered optimal. This is how Krieg maintains population levels sufficient to supply the Imperial Guard with the endless stream of soldiers required to fulfill the Death Korps of Krieg's reputation as humanity's most expendable but most reliable military asset. 4726, female, now designated 4726, female, maternal 1 to indicate one successful reproduction continues her work. Her hands worsen, arthritis developing from the repetitive stress, dexterity declining, productivity dropping to 387 lenses per shift at 0.07% error rate. At age 27, she's reassigned from precision assembly to general labor, moving materials between sections, operating cargo elevators, maintaining basic facility cleanliness. The work is less skilled but more physically demanding, a different kind of degradation as her body slowly breaks down from decades of hard labor and accumulated environmental damage. She's assigned 2 more reproductive cycles over the next 6 years, producing 2 more children she never sees beyond the brief moments after birth. One is female, apparently healthy. The other is male, terminated at birth due to detected genetic abnormalities that would have compromised military fitness. The termination is noted in her record as reproductive failure, which slightly lowers her breeding priority for future cycles. But it doesn't emotionally affect her, because she never developed attachment to the fetus, never conceptualized it as a person rather than a biological process occurring in her body. By age 35, her productivity has declined to the point where reassignment is necessary. She's transferred to the agricultural sectors, massive underground caverns where fungi are cultivated on corpse starch substrate, where algae pools produce oxygen and protein, where cave-adapted grains grow under artificial lighting that mimics but doesn't replicate natural sunlight. The agricultural work is monotonous in different ways: harvesting fungal growth, tending algae pools, moving grow lights to optimal positions. The air in the agricultural sectors is thick with spores and humidity, hard on lungs even through rebreathers. Many agricultural workers develop respiratory conditions that eventually force reassignment to even less demanding roles. 4726 female maternal 1 works in agriculture for 8 years. Her health continues to decline, respiratory capacity reduced, skeletal structure weakened by insufficient calcium absorption, early signs of radiation, induced cellular damage that suggests future cancer development. At age 43, she's reassigned to education services, teaching basic literacy and numeracy to children aged 5 to 7 in one of the communal child facilities. It's considered light duty, appropriate for workers whose physical capabilities have degraded below productive thresholds, but whose cognitive function remains adequate. This is where she finally encounters something resembling purpose beyond mere productivity. The children, designations, not individuals, never individuals, are blank slates, their personalities not yet fully suppressed by conditioning. They still show curiosity, still ask questions, still exhibit the natural human tendency toward playfulness and wonder. 40726, female maternal 1's job is to eliminate these tendencies, to teach them that curiosity is dangerous, that questions are inefficient, that play is wasteful, to condition them through repetition and reinforcement to accept their place in the collective machinery of Krieg society. She does this with competent efficiency, takes no pleasure in crushing children's spirits, but feels no guilt about it either. This is simply necessary for their survival and functionality in the system they've been born into. Allowing them to maintain hope or individuality would be cruelty, giving them expectations that could never be fulfilled and would only cause suffering when reality inevitably crushed those expectations. Better to condition them young, better to teach them acceptance, better to prepare them for lives of service and suffering by eliminating the possibility of imagining anything different. She teaches them to read, but only functional text equipment manuals, safety protocols, production quotas. She teaches them mathematics, but only applied calculations, resource allocation, productivity rates, statistical analysis of manufacturing efficiency. She teaches them history, but only the approved narrative. Krieg's fall to heresy, its purging, its eternal penance through military service. She does not teach them about beauty or love or hope or any of the human experiences that exist outside Krieg's underground complexes. These concepts are considered dangerous, remnants of the individualism and hedonism that led to the heresy. Years pass. 4726 female maternal 1 transitions into her 50s. Her health continues to deteriorate, vision declining, hearing damaged by decades of industrial noise, organs slowly failing from accumulated radiation damage and chemical contamination. She's developed multiple cancers, all treatable enough to maintain functionality, but not enough to restore health. Her rations are reduced as her productivity decreases. This is standard. Krieg operates on strict resource optimization principles. Workers who contribute less receive less, a straightforward calculation that ensures resources are allocated where they generate maximum return for the Imperium. She's hungry most of the time now, not starving. That would be wasteful, killing her before her utility is fully extracted. But operating on minimal calories, her body consuming itself slowly to supplement inadequate nutrition. She loses weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that was never substantial to begin with. At age 58, her cancer progresses to the point where further treatment is deemed economically non-viable. She's transferred to Final Services, a facility where Krieg citizens go when their productive life has ended but death has not yet claimed them. Final Services is not a hospital or hospice in any conventional sense. It's a facility where the dying are maintained at minimum viable comfort while their bodies are processed for maximum resource recovery. Organs that remain functional are harvested for other citizens whose conditions are more treatable. Blood and tissue are screened and stored for medical use. Everything that can be salvaged is salvaged. 4726 female maternal 1, now simply 4726 female again as her maternal designation no longer matters, spends her final weeks in a ward with hundreds of other dying citizens. The space is crowded, the conditions basic, the care minimal but adequate to prevent unnecessary suffering. She lies in her assigned bed and experiences something she hasn't felt in decades: stillness. No work to perform, no duties to fulfill, no productivity quotas to meet. Just the slow process of biological shutdown, consciousness persisting as flesh fails. She thinks about her life, trying to assess whether it had meaning, whether her existence served purposes worth the suffering endured. The conditioning insists yes. She contributed to the Imperium, produced 3 offspring, maintained adequate productivity for 43 years of her 58-year life. By Krieg standards, she's been successful. But underneath the conditioning, in spaces of consciousness that were never fully suppressed, she wonders whether there should have been more. Whether life should include experiences beyond work and reproduction and slow degradation. Whether the humans who live on other worlds, who see real skies and breathe real air and form actual relationships, whether their lives are fundamentally different from hers in ways that matter. She'll never know the answers to these questions. She dies at age 58, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of nearly 6 decades of underground life in toxic conditions. Her death is recorded in the Population Management Database as 4726 female, expired day 287 year 9A7 M41, cause multiple system failure secondary to radiation exposure and industrial contamination, organs harvested non-viable, biomass recycled. 47 kilograms. 3 children survive her, though they never know of her death and wouldn't recognize her if they encountered her remains. Hundreds of thousands of Lasgun Power Pack spare components she installed during her years in Manufacturum 7 Alpha 3. Dozens of child citizens received conditioning she provided during her time in education services. Her contribution to the Imperium is measurable, quantifiable, documented in productivity reports and resource allocation databases. By these metrics, her life was successful, her existence justified, her suffering worthwhile because it supported the Emperor's great work. But was it worth it from her subjective perspective? Did the consciousness that inhabited designation 4726 female experience anything that made 5 decades of grinding labor and suffering meaningful? Did she ever feel joy or love or satisfaction, or any of the positive emotions that make human existence something more than just biological processes occurring in meat? The answer is probably not, and that's the point. Krieg citizens aren't supposed to experience joy, aren't supposed to form attachments, aren't supposed to find individual satisfaction or pursue personal fulfillment. Those are the corrupting influences that led to the heresy, the selfish desires that must be permanently purged from the population to prevent recurrence. So life on Krieg continues. Millions of citizens like 4726, female living identical existences born in darkness, raised in communal facilities, assigned to productive labor, reproduced under controlled conditions, worked until biological failure, processed for resource recovery, and replaced by the next generation that will experience exactly the same cycle. This is what daily life looks like for civilians on Krieg, not the heroic sacrifice of the Death Korps charging across battlefield under artillery fire, but the grinding horror of civilian existence that produces those soldiers. Not dramatic moments of glory, but decades of repetitive labor in toxic conditions performed by humans who've been systematically stripped of everything that makes human existence meaningful beyond mere biological function. The Death Korps of Krieg is renowned throughout the Imperium as humanity's most expendable military asset. Soldiers who fight with such dedication that they're willing to die in numbers that would break other regiments. Their willingness to sacrifice is legendary, their courage under fire unquestioned, their value to the Imperial Guard unmatched by any force except perhaps the Space Marines. But that willingness to die doesn't come from natural courage or trained discipline alone. It comes from growing up in conditions where death is genuinely preferable to continued existence, where life is so devoid of meaning or pleasure that throwing it away in combat seems like reasonable trade for the possibility that your sacrifice might serve some greater purpose. The civilians of Krieg don't produce fearless soldiers through superior training or genetic selection. They produce them through systematic elimination of everything that makes life worth living, through creation of conditions so miserable that being shipped off to die on distant battlefields represents improvement rather than punishment. This is the truth the Departamento Munitorum doesn't advertise when requisitioning Death Korps regiments. This is the cost no one discusses when praising Krieg's military contributions. This is the horror that makes the Death Korps possible, an entire planet transformed into a machine that produces soldiers by grinding civilians into meat and conditioning the survivors to believe that military service leading to death is reward rather than tragedy. Millions of 4726 females exist right now on Krieg, working in manufactorums, agricultural sectors, maintenance facilities, education centers, living lives devoid of beauty, joy, connection, or hope. Producing children they'll never know, working until their bodies fail, dying without anyone mourning their loss, because mourning implies attachment and attachment implies the kind of individual emotional investment that Krieg's culture has systematically eliminated. They are the true cost of the Death Korps, not the soldiers who die gloriously on battlefields, but the civilians who live in conditions that make death on battlefields seem like merciful release. Not the heroes whose sacrifices are commemorated, but the masses whose suffering is never acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require confronting whether any military objective justifies this level of sustained horror inflicted on entire populations. The Imperium needs its Death Korps regiments, needs the soldiers who'll charge into certain death without hesitation, who'll hold positions against impossible odds, who'll die in their millions to win victories that more cautious forces couldn't achieve. The strategic value is undeniable, but the cost, the real cost measured in civilian suffering rather than military casualties, is something the Imperium prefers not to calculate too precisely, because if you actually quantified the horror of daily existence on Krieg, if you measured the suffering of millions of civilians living and dying in darkness over centuries, you might conclude that no military objective justifies this cost. So the Departamento Munitorum takes the soldiers Krieg produces and doesn't ask too many questions about the conditions that produce them. Takes the endless regiments of expendable warriors and deploys them to the most desperate battles without examining too closely what made them so willing to die. And on Krieg, in the darkness 500 meters below an irradiated surface, millions of designations wake to sirens, work their shifts, reproduce under controlled conditions, and die without ever experiencing anything that baseline humanity would recognize as making life worth living. This is the agony of immortality on Krieg, not that individuals live forever, but that the system persists eternally, generation after generation experiencing identical suffering, the horror never ending because the planet's penance for its ancient heresy must continue until the Imperium itself falls or the Emperor releases them from their eternal service. And neither seems likely to happen within any time frame that matters to the individuals currently suffering through this existence. So they continue. Wake, work, reproduce, die. Endless cycle, mindless repetition, suffering without meaning except the abstract claim that it serves the emperor's purposes. Generation after generation, century after century, eternally grinding human consciousness into meat for the imperial war machine. This is what daily life on Krieg really means. This is the cost of the Death Korps. This is the horror that produces humanity's most reliable soldiers. Remember this when you hear about Death Korps victories, about their legendary courage, about their willing sacrifice. Remember that behind every regiment stands millions of civilians living in conditions that make death in combat seem like salvation. Remember that the expendable soldiers are produced by even more expendable civilians, civilians whose suffering never ends and whose names are never recorded because they don't have names, just designations, just numbers in population databases, just meat being processed through a system that's been optimized to produce soldiers and nothing else. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even life on Imperial worlds can be horror beyond measure, and Krieg, proud, penitent, dedicated Krieg, represents that horror at its most systematic, most efficient, most sustained. They call it duty. They call it penance. They call it service. But from inside the system, living through decades of grinding, meaningless suffering, it's just existence devoid of everything that makes existence worthwhile, consciousness trapped in meat that's slowly degrading in darkness, serving purposes so abstract they become meaningless to the individuals whose suffering produces them. This is Krieg. This is what it means to be a civilian on the Imperium's most militarized world. This is the cost no one discusses when requisitioning more regiments of expendable soldiers. And it continues, right now, millions of designations experiencing identical horror, producing the next generation who will experience identical horror, eternally perpetuating a system built on suffering that serves purposes none of them can meaningfully understand or consent to. The agony isn't immortality of individuals. It's immortality of the system, the culture, the grinding horror that persists across centuries, consuming humans and producing soldiers in an endless cycle that may never end as long as the Imperium requires expendable warriors for its endless wars. This is Krieg's gift to the Imperium, not just soldiers, but a demonstration of how far human suffering can be systematized, how completely individual humanity can be erased in service to collective purpose, how thoroughly a population can be conditioned to accept horror as normal. And the Imperium accepts this gift gratefully, deploys these soldiers proudly, and never asks too many questions about the hell that produced them. Because some questions are too uncomfortable to answer honestly. And is this suffering justified? Is definitely one of them. The children she taught in her final productive years are now adults themselves, working their own shifts in manufacturums and agricultural sectors, perpetuating the cycle. Some have already reproduced under controlled conditions, creating the next generation who will experience identical existence. The genetic material from her 3 offspring has proliferated through the population, scattered across thousands of descendants who share fragments of her DNA but no knowledge of her existence. One of her children, the female born when she was 21, eventually joins the Death Korps, designated 88472, male after gender reassignment surgery performed on all female Guard recruits to optimize unit cohesion and eliminate complications of mixed gender units. This descendant serves with distinction for 7 years across 4 different war zones before being killed by Orc artillery on a world whose name is recorded only in military archives. 88472, male dies believing death in service was highest honor possible. That sacrifice for the Emperor represented ultimate purpose. That 7 years of constant combat and horror were worthwhile because they served humanity's survival. The conditioning worked perfectly, as it was designed to do, but 88472, male's biological mother, 476, female, died never knowing this child existed beyond the moment of birth, never learning whether her genetic material propagated successfully, never discovering that her suffering produced a soldier who died believing that suffering was noble and death was glorious. Is this a tragedy? By Krieg standards, no. Mother and child both fulfilled their designated functions, one producing genetic material and labor for 4 decades, the other fighting and dying for 7 years. Both contributed to the Imperium's continued existence. Both served purposes larger than themselves. Both lived and died exactly as the system intended. By any other standard, by the standards that govern most human societies, even in the grimdark horror of the 41st millennium, it's monstrous. It's the systematic elimination of everything that makes human consciousness valuable beyond mere biological function. It's the reduction of persons to production units, of lives to statistics, of suffering to acceptable operational costs. But Krieg doesn't operate by other standards. Krieg operates by standards developed after 5 billion people died in a civil war so catastrophic it rendered an entire planet uninhabitable for thousands of years. Standards designed to ensure that kind of individualistic heresy never happens again, no matter what cost must be paid to prevent it. The cost is measured in consciousness experiencing suffering without meaning, in generations living and dying in conditions that make death preferable, in systematic elimination of everything joyful or beautiful or worth preserving about human existence. And the payment continues. Will continue. May never stop continuing as long as the Imperium requires soldiers and Krieg provides them through this mechanism of civilizational horror. Other Imperial worlds contribute to the Guard through conventional recruitment, volunteers seeking adventure or purpose, conscripts fulfilling mandatory service, criminals offered military service instead of execution. These soldiers may die in equal numbers, may serve with comparable courage, but they at least came from lives that included something beyond pure suffering. They had childhoods where play was permitted. They formed friendships based on genuine affection rather than utilitarian proximity. They experienced pleasure in food, in rest, in simple human joys that make existence tolerable. When they die in service, they're sacrificing lives that had value beyond military utility. Krieg soldiers sacrifice lives that never had that value. Lives that were engineered from birth to produce exactly this outcome, willing death in service to abstract purposes. They're not brave for accepting death. They're conditioned to the point where death represents reward rather than loss, where dying in service is presented as only circumstance where their existence achieves meaning. This is more disturbing than conventional military sacrifice because it reveals what human consciousness can be molded into accepting through systematic conditioning from birth. It demonstrates that with sufficient control over environment and education and social structures, you can make people genuinely believe that lives of pure suffering are noble, that deaths in service are glorious, that the elimination of everything that makes life worth living is justified by abstract military necessity. The philosophical implications are worse than the immediate suffering. 4726, female's physical pain and deprivation were substantial, her life objectively horrible by any reasonable standard. But at least she experienced that suffering while retaining enough consciousness to potentially recognize it as suffering. The soldiers produced by this system have had that recognition capacity trained out of them. They experience equal or greater suffering. Combat is worse than factory work in most measurable ways, but they experience it without recognizing it as suffering. They've been conditioned to reinterpret pain as purpose, death as achievement, horror as duty fulfilled. This is the ultimate expression of the Imperium's philosophy, not just forcing people to suffer for strategic purposes, but conditioning them to believe that suffering is itself virtuous, that accepting horror without complaint represents highest human achievement, that eliminating your own capacity for joy and meaning is noble self-sacrifice rather than psychological destruction. Krieg takes this philosophy to its logical extreme. Not content with soldiers who die bravely, they've created soldiers who desperately want to die, who view death as reward, who measure their worth entirely by how effectively they can be expended in combat. This makes them extraordinarily effective military assets because they genuinely don't care about survival. Genuinely will execute any order regardless of cost. Genuinely believe that the more horrifically they die, the more meaningful their existence becomes. But it only works because behind every soldier stands the civilian population that produced them. Behind every regiment of expendable warriors stands millions of civilians living in systematic horror, their suffering optimized to produce the psychological conditions necessary for creating soldiers who view death as salvation. The Departamento Munitorum's requisition forms don't mention this. When they request another 10 regiments from Krieg, they're not explicitly requesting the suffering of millions of civilians to maintain the population that produces those regiments. They're just requesting soldiers, professional military assets to be deployed as strategic necessity dictates. But the suffering is implicit in the request. Every regiment requires population maintenance. Every soldier requires civilians producing food, equipment, and replacement population. Every generation of expendable warriors requires previous generation of civilians living in conditions that make military service seem attractive by comparison. This is the machine that Krieg has become: input of civilian suffering, output of military effectiveness. The conversion process so efficient that it can sustain itself across centuries without anyone outside the system examining too closely whether the output justifies the input. And the truly horrifying aspect is that the machine is self-perpetuating. The children of Krieg don't rebel against their conditions because they don't know conditions could be different. The adults don't question the system because questioning has been systematically eliminated through conditioning. The elderly don't look back on their lives with regret because regret requires believing your suffering could have been avoided. And they've been taught that suffering was necessary, noble, the only appropriate response to their planet's ancient sin. Krieg's culture has achieved something remarkable. It's created a population that genuinely accepts endless suffering as correct and proper. Not forced acceptance through threat of punishment, but genuine internalized belief that this is how life should be, that any alternative would represent corruption and weakness. This is far more sustainable than systems based on coercion. Coercion requires constant enforcement, constant monitoring, constant threat of violence to maintain compliance. Krieg has moved beyond coercion into true ideological control, where the population polices itself, where deviation is reported not from fear, but from genuine belief that deviation threatens the collective good. The cost of achieving this level of control is measurable in the suffering of every individual consciousness subjected to the system. Billions of humans across 5 centuries, each one experiencing decades of grinding horror, all so the system can perpetuate itself and continue producing soldiers for the Imperium's endless wars. Is this justified? The Imperium says yes, citing strategic necessity and the absolute requirement for loyal expendable troops. Krieg itself says yes, citing eternal penance for the ancient heresy and the belief that suffering purifies. The Death Korps says yes through their actions, their willing sacrifice, apparently validating the system that produced them. But the answer depends entirely on whether you value the Imperium's strategic interests more than the subjective experience of billions of conscious beings. Whether you believe collective survival justifies individual suffering on this scale. Whether you think the ends of military effectiveness justify the means of systematic psychological destruction across entire populations. There's no objectively correct answer, but there is an honest answer: the cost is real. The suffering is immense, and the Imperium prefers not to calculate too precisely because the numbers would be uncomfortable even by grimdark standards. In parallel to 4726, Female's story, millions of other designations experience their own variations on the same theme. Some live longer, some shorter. Some achieve slightly higher productivity, some slightly lower. Some produce more offspring, some fewer. But all follow the same basic pattern: birth in darkness, childhood conditioning, adult labor, controlled reproduction, degradation through accumulated damage. death without meaning beyond statistics. There are no heroes among Krieg civilians, no inspirational stories of individuals overcoming their circumstances, no narratives of personal achievement or extraordinary lives. Just endless repetition of the same grinding existence, consciousness experiencing suffering without the possibility of transcendence or escape. This is deliberate. Heroes imply individuals. Inspirational stories imply personal agency. Extraordinary lives imply that some lives are more valuable than others. All these concepts threaten the fundamental principle that everyone is equally expendable, equally obligated to sacrifice, equally devoid of special consideration. Krieg's culture has successfully eliminated the concept of the individual mattering beyond their functional utility. 4726, female didn't matter as a person, only as a labor unit and genetic material source. Her children don't matter as her legacy, only as future labor units and soldiers. Her death doesn't matter as the loss of a unique consciousness, only as a resource allocation event requiring replacement from population reserves. This creates a kind of immortality, but not the positive kind. The system is immortal, persisting across generations while individual consciousness is disposable and meaningless. The culture is immortal, reproducing itself perfectly through comprehensive conditioning of each generation. The suffering is immortal, perpetuating eternally as each generation experiences identical horror. But the individuals are not immortal. They live, suffer, and die quickly by imperial standards. Average lifespan on Krieg is 47 years compared to 60 plus on most imperial worlds, and hundreds for those wealthy enough to afford juvenat treatments. They burn out fast, consumed by the system that gave them life and takes it back with equal indifference. This is the agony of immortality that the title references, not that individuals live too long, but that the system that causes their suffering is effectively immortal, that the horror perpetuates endlessly while individuals are consumed and replaced, that consciousness after consciousness experiences the same grinding existence without hope that it will ever change or end. 500 years after the Civil War that destroyed Krieg's surface, the penance continues. 500 years of civilians living in darkness, working until exhaustion, reproducing without joy, dying without meaning. 500 years of soldiers marching to death believing it's noble. 500 years of the Imperium accepting this arrangement as legitimate and proper. And it will continue for 500 more years, or 5,000, or until the Imperium itself falls, because no one with power to change it has sufficient motivation to do so. The system works from a strategic perspective. The soldiers it produces are valuable. The cost is paid by people who have no voice and no ability to refuse payment. So the machine continues, grinding human consciousness into meat, converting suffering into military effectiveness, perpetuating across generations with systematic precision that would be admirable if it weren't horrifying. Somewhere on Krieg right now, a designation is waking to sirens, performing morning routine with mechanical precision, preparing for another shift in a manufacturum or agricultural sector or education facility, living another day of existence devoid of meaning beyond productivity metrics and resource optimization calculations. That designation doesn't know that life could be different, doesn't dream of escape because escape is incomprehensible, doesn't question the system because questioning was conditioned out before consciousness could fully form. Just accepts and endures, and eventually dies without ever experiencing anything that would make the endurance worthwhile. And the system notes the death, processes the remains for resource recovery, and assigns another designation to fill the now vacant production slot. Seamless replacement, perfect continuity, the machine never stopping because individual components are infinitely replaceable. This is what immortality looks like when applied to systems rather than individuals. This is what eternal service means when examined from the perspective of those serving. This is the agony that persists across centuries while individuals suffer and die and are forgotten. The Imperium of Man contains approximately 1 million worlds, each contributing to humanity's collective survival in various ways. Some provide food, some provide raw materials, some provide manufactured goods, some provide soldiers. Krieg provides soldiers more efficiently than almost any other world, provides them in quantities that seem endless, provides them with psychological conditioning that makes them extraordinarily effective despite limited training and equipment, provides them so reliably that the Departamento Munitorum can requisition Krieg regiments knowing they'll arrive at full strength, properly equipped, and absolutely committed to mission completion regardless of casualties. This efficiency is celebrated. Krieg is praised for its dedication, honored for its sacrifice, respected for its contribution to the Imperial war effort. The Death Korps' reputation is legendary, their willingness to die making them valuable assets in the Imperium's most desperate battles. But that efficiency is built on the suffering of millions of civilians whose names are never recorded, whose lives are never celebrated, whose sacrifices are never honored because they didn't sacrifice dramatically on battlefields, but slowly in factories and agricultural sectors and breeding facilities. The true cost of the Death Korps is paid by civilians who will never be remembered, who live and die in darkness without anyone caring, except as entries in population management databases. They are the foundation upon which the Death Korps' reputation rests, the invisible suffering that makes visible military effectiveness possible. And they will continue suffering as long as the Imperium needs their planet's soldiers. As long as the strategic calculus favors expendable warriors over alternatives that might require acknowledging that this cost is too high, as long as no one with authority to change the system has incentive to do so. The agony of immortality, experienced not by individuals who live too long but by systems that persist too long, by suffering that continues too long, by horror that's sustained too long to remember when it started or imagine when it might end. This is Krieg. This is what it means to be a civilian on the Imperium's most dedicated penitent world. This is the cost of producing humanity's most expendable soldiers, and it continues. Right now, millions experiencing it, millions more who will experience it in future generations, eternally grinding consciousness into meat for the Imperial war machine. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war. And behind every war stands civilians whose suffering makes war possible, whose lives are consumed to produce soldiers, whose consciousness experiences horror so sustained and systematic that it becomes the normal background of existence, rather than exceptional tragedy. Remember this when you see Death Korps regiments on tabletops or in artwork or in stories. Remember that behind every miniature soldier stands millions of invisible civilians whose suffering produced that soldier's willingness to die. Remember that the legendary courage and dedication comes not from superior human qualities, but from systematic elimination of everything that makes life worth living. Remember that the Imperium's most expendable soldiers come from its most suffering civilians, that the military effectiveness you admire is purchased with horror you'd find intolerable if examined honestly. And remember that this horror is not exceptional on Krieg but systemic, not temporary but eternal, not individual but collective across entire populations and centuries of time. This is the price of the Death Korps. This is the cost the Imperium pays in civilian suffering for military effectiveness. This is what immortality means when the suffering is immortal and the individuals are disposable. And it will never end as long as the machine continues turning, grinding humanity into meat, converting consciousness into soldiers, perpetuating across centuries because no one with power to stop it has reason to care about those being consumed by it. The agony continues. The immortality persists. The suffering is eternal. And somewhere in darkness 500 meters below Krieg's irradiated surface, a designation wakes to sirens, performs routine, and begins another day of existence that makes death in combat seem like liberation rather than tragedy. This is Krieg's gift to the Imperium, not just soldiers, but proof that human consciousness can be systematically destroyed while biological function persists. That suffering can be sustained indefinitely across populations. That horror can become so normalized it's mistaken for duty and purpose. And the Imperium accepts this gift without examining its implications too closely, because some truths are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. And the truth about Krieg is definitely one of them.